Tēnā koutou katoa, ko tangihu te manga, ko wairoa te awa, no tangataroria aho, ko Glen Cornelius taku ingoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Welcome everyone, my name's Glen Cornelius. I'm the Chief Executive of Harrison Grierson and also the Deputy President of Engineering New Zealand. Great to have you all here today. Many of you will be familiar with Engineering New Zealand's Engineers Climate Action Program. As part of this program, we're organising climate korero conversations so engineers can discuss the specifics around climate change and climate action. Sharing ideas and coming together over common problems is a key area of focus for these climate conversations. Today is the first climate conversation that we'll be hosting as Engineering New Zealand, and I'll be talking with Akuhata Bailey-Winiata. Akuhata is a scientist with tribal connections to Te Arawa, Tūhoe, and also through Tūwharetoa. He has a BSc in Earth Science as well as a Masters of Science from the Waikato University, which was about investigating the potential exposure of coastal marae and urupā, that's Maori cemeteries, to the impacts of sea level rise around Aotearoa, New Zealand. He's a keen academic and he's embarked on a PhD at the University of Waikato, which has been funded through the Resilience to Nature's Challenge, a national science challenge, with supervisors from the Auckland University. And this is being co-developed with coastal marae communities to look at decolonisation and managed retreat process for Maori in response to sea level rise. Today, Akuhata will speak about his work on the relevance and application of mātauranga Maori and also Te Ao Māori in climate change, and what Te Ao Māori can teach us all about climate change. So I welcome Akuhata and look forward to your presentation.
Kia ora koutou. Let me just click the slide. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko ngangataha te maunga, ko Te Arawa te waka, ko te rotoro nui a kahu matu moemoe te roto, ko tono hopu te marae, no rotoro a hau, no County Donegal, Ireland, me Plymouth, England, oku matua tipuna, ko Akuhata Bailey-Winiata tōku ingoa. Kia ora koutou, my name is Akuhata Bailey-Winiata, as Glenn introduced. I have a PhD researcher at the University of Waikato. What I just ran through was my pepeha, or my Māori introduction of myself. And in that introduction, I connected myself to landmarks that I affiliate to. So I've connected myself to my maunga or mountain Ngataha, to my marae, tono hopu, which you can see here, and where I'm from, which is Aotearoa. The idea of positionality and who you are is really important to Te Ao Māori, mātauranga Māori. Positioning yourself where you are, where you stand, is a vital prerequisite to understand how Te Ao Māori can influence our research and as well as our perceptions of climate change. So as Glenn said, I have a BSc and MSc, Masters of Science and Bachelors of Science. I was the first in my whānau, as you can see in this picture, to attend university and graduate. So humble beginnings. So that is who I am, and I'm going to talk to you about some key ideas around Te Ao Māori and mātauranga Māori and what we can learn from them, as well as how I've incorporated them into my specific research around coastal marae and sea level rise. So, yep, basically I just ran through the agenda, what we're going to cover. So specifically, what can we learn from Te Ao Māori? I took a long time to really think about this because there's so much in Te Ao Māori and mātauranga Māori that we can use to understand climate change. But given it's a 15-minute presentation I have to give, I wanted to narrow it down. So we're going to discuss the concept of time, the concepts of pūrākau, as well as research at the interface of two knowledge systems. So let's get into it. Firstly, what is the worldview? Again, I took some time to think about this presentation, and I was thinking I wanted to jump straight into the discussion, but I felt like we had to start with the bare bones. So what is a worldview? So worldview is our perceptions, which can be influenced through things such as culture, identity, religion, and it influences how we, our perspectives on the world and what we see our place within that world, within that environment. This then leads into what is Te Ao Māori, or the translation Māori worldview. So for me, my Māori worldview, or my idea of Te Ao Māori, always comes back to this image that we can see here, done by Arthur Thatcher. It talks about the creation story, of the Māori creation story. In the beginning, we have Papa Tuanuku, our Earth Mother, and Ranginui, our Sky Father. In the beginning, they are locked in an embrace with their children, who are atua, or deities, locked in between them. Their children got fed up of being locked between their parents, as every kid does, and they wanted to explore the world and see what life had to offer. So they hitched a plan, all but a couple of siblings who weren't keen on the idea, and they chose Tane Mahuta, or the god of the forests, to separate his parents. So he laid on his back upon his mother and pushed his father up with his legs up into the heavens. That created that separation in between. So this whole idea of Te Ao Māori and the way Māori view the world comes back to this story. We see ourselves as not exempt from the environment, but we see ourselves as part of the environment. We come from the separation of Papa Tuanuku and Ranginui. We are kin to the environment, and hence we have an obligation to look after our Earth Mother, our Sky Father, i.e. the taiao, the environment. This is particularly important when we look at the idea of climate change and how the climate has changed due to urbanisation, industrialisation, that sort of things. We haven't been taking that duty of care for our Earth Mother and Sky Father. So that's a really key concept to understand. Now, the idea of mātauranga Māori, it's a real buzzword in research and industry, but mātauranga Māori to me is Māori intergenerational knowledge. And I don't really like to have heaps of words on some slides, so I was trying to find, okay, what's a really cool diagram that really encapsulates what mātauranga Māori means to me. And I couldn't find one that really spoke to me, so I was like, okay, what does mātauranga mean to me? It is intergenerational, as you can see by this image of this kura we worked with, doing science workshops. It's communication, so at wānanga, at conferences, and working with like-minded people. That is what mātauranga means to me. So mātauranga Māori, these images encapsulate that, and the role that mātauranga Māori has in our understanding of the taiao is really important. And the gems that mātauranga Māori can have in understanding climate change is going to be really important heading into the future. I'm going to come back to that later on in terms of mātauranga Māori and climate change. I just wanted to give a good definition of how I see it. So climate change and Indigenous perspective. So I'm sure you are all aware of what climate change is. Increased greenhouse gas concentration has led to the atmosphere to warm up and da-da-da-da-da. And this has led to so many impacts that this image shows. So as you can see, it's so broad, so diverse, so variable. It's quite hard to focus on one sort of impact of climate change. So my research is surrounding the idea of sea level rise and sea levels rising. So climate change has been, climate change is a consequence of ideas like urbanisation, industrialisation. But when we look at it from the perspective of Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples and cultures, we can see that it always comes back down to one idea or one point in history, the idea of colonisation. Colonisation by the coloniser during the 17th and 18th centuries upon the colonised, often Indigenous communities around the globe, has led to their vulnerability as associated with colonisation, also the idea of capitalism, industrialisation, urbanisation, over-intensification, extractivism. All those things have accompanied colonisation along the way. So from the perspective of an Indigenous community, climate change is really a consequence of colonisation. And it's really important to factor this in, as I'll mention later, in terms of adaptation for Indigenous communities around the globe. Factoring in and being cognizant of this history will be really important to deliver on positive outcomes heading into the future. So, what can we learn from Te Ao Māori to understand the climate change issue and climate change impacts? So this idea of time, so far through my PhD journey, the idea of time has really interested me, especially when we refer that to the idea of climate change. So in the literature, we have this idea of Western linear time. So that could be the Gregorian calendar. It could be past, present, and future silos of separating how we view our time on Earth. When we regard it to climate change, often climate change in time is thought of as a ticking time clock. So, we have projections of 2100 when A, B, and C impacts will occur. The idea of tyranny of the present, which is quite recent in the literature, it looks at the idea of people in power, politicians, etc., have this tyranny of the present. They can only think within the present silo of time. They can't think further ahead into the future for future generations. When we compare this to Indigenous time, which is event-based, past and future are just as important as the present. Indigenous time is interconnected, it's intergenerational, and oftentimes with regard to climate change, changes in the environment in terms of time are changes in kinship relationships. So that means the relationship with the land, with the environment, with resources, and how those relationships change with the changing in climate. So some key points about time is a famous Whakataukia Māori proverb brought up by Rameka 2016, he whakatamuri te haere whakamoa, I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on my past. And this really hones in on the idea that in Te Ao Māori, looking to the past, looking to your elders to understand how we can move forward into the future is a really key concept to Te Ao Māori. And that helps in terms of climate change impacts. We look to the past of what had happened in that past, understand, okay, what's happening in the present? Okay, now what do we need to do in the future? So there's several parallels we can draw with this. In Te Ao Māori, precedence is placed on future generations. There was a report written by Wendy Saunders who discussed this idea of time, and she did a comparison in the Bay of Plenty region of Pakeha communities and Māori communities and how they perceive the impact of natural hazards and climate change. And an interesting point is that for the Pakeha community, they valued their present. They put higher value on their present compared to their future generations, whereas Māori placed far more value on the future than they did on the present, which is an interesting parallel to draw. The idea of putting precedence on the future generations is helpful when we're considering long-term adaptation solutions to combat climate change, as well as this idea of Indigenous time helps us understand what climate change impacts will be like for our future generations. Often, currently in Western time, we get stuck in this present frame of mind, and it's hard to picture what's going to happen in the future. But we need to be cognizant of this because the future generations are the ones who are going to have to face the consequences of the decisions made today. So time is it's a huge topic, but I think it's really important in understanding Te Ao Māori and climate change. Another idea is natural hazards and pūrākau or ancestral stories. So Māori have inhabited Aotearoa New Zealand for centuries and have had to adapt and be resilient to natural hazards. Because New Zealand is full of natural hazards, ranging from volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunami, etc. We are so diverse in terms of our hazardscape. However, climate change is exacerbating these natural hazard risks and the impacts are becoming more severe. This graph on our left was done by King, Goff and Skipper, and this just illustrates the variability of pūrākau referring to natural hazard events. Pūrākau contain knowledge about these natural hazards and is transmitted through storytelling. For instance, the Maratā example, where a traditional Māori myth held clues to what type of natural hazards and where they occur in that area. So really common to pūrākau is the concept of taniwha or water spirits, which are common within the natural hazard scape. Often taniwha are a sign of danger or that caution should be shown, and this was exhibited in the Maratā debris flows in the early 2000s. So at Maratā, the stream that goes through the township, the pūrākau surrounding that stream it's a tail of a taniwha, and as a tail it flicks side to side, which is indicative of a river changing its course as part of its natural variability. Now, the marae within Maratā followed this pūrākau, and they were positioned in zones where this tail had never flicked. However, during that early 2000 debris flow, the tail flicked as it does, and the non-Māori homes who were positioned where this tail was flicking were impacted by the debris flow. So it's little gems like that that are held within our pūrākau, which are really important in understanding how, one, we can react to climate change. If we use that pūrākau, for instance, where should we put our homes or where should we put our infrastructure so that climate change or natural hazards won't impact them? So it's using those gems to understand how we can react to the impact of climate change. So we've talked about mātauranga Māori in the form of pūrākau and time and Western science in terms of climate change research. But what does it look like at the interface? So one real foundation document for my research is the one brought out by Sir Mason Jury, where he talks about research at this interface. So in a key quote brought out by him was, rather than contesting the validities of one knowledge system over the other, there's increasing amount of research that's happening at the interface of these two systems, drawing strength from both of these knowledge systems, Indigenous knowledge, mātauranga Māori, Western science, bringing them together to deliver on positive outcomes. And oftentimes research at that interface can deliver far better outcomes than either outcomes sought in individual knowledge streams. I draw strength from this idea of research at the interface because I am a researcher at the interface of these two knowledge systems. A really keystone way that research at the interface is conducted is the idea of the Braided Rivers approach, which was brought out by McFarlane et al. 2015. And this is synonymous with the common braided rivers of the South Island of New Zealand, where these large river systems head toward the coast, and they're full of tiny streams and tributaries heading toward the coast. And like a braided river, these streams cross over, diverge, converge. And on either side of these river systems, metaphorically speaking, we have Western science on one side and mātauranga Māori or Te Ao Māori on the other side. Now, research at the interface, we draw these two together, these two knowledge systems. They can diverge because sometimes they just don't collate in that way, but we head towards that common goal, that common positive outcome for the research. So this is just a tangible example of what research at that interface looks like. So now, what does that look like in terms of my research? So as Glenn said, I did my master's, finished halfway through last year, and I started my PhD end of last year. And the master's looked at, okay, there are so many stories in the news talking about how marae were being impacted by sea level rise, how urupā were being eroded, but nothing was really done in terms of hard science. So that's what my master's did. We looked at the exposure of coastal marae. So we had 191 marae within 1 kilometre of the coastline. We then looked at their exposure to 100-year flood event with increments of sea level rise added, which you can see on the left here. And that indicated that there were 41 marae that were going to be impacted by a 100-year extreme sea level event. And with sea level rise, it's just exacerbated. The difference with that research, yes, we had that hardcore science, but we also looked at marae differently. So often in Western risk assessments, They view buildings as a built asset worth X amount of money. However, we didn't look at it like that. We looked at marae as significant places within our environment. So this middle diagram here illustrates that. Marae provide that connection between Papatuanuku, our Earth Mother, and Ranginui, our Sky Father. They're steeped in whakapapa or genealogy. Marae are turanga waiwai, they provide sense of place and a sense of being for people who affiliate to that marae. Marae are home for pūrākau or ancestral stories, like I mentioned earlier. Marae show manaakitanga or generosity in times of need, which is shown through their tikanga and whakamarumare or protection, as marae are often used as civil defence evacuation sites during natural hazards and natural disasters. So that's where the Masters was at. And now more research is coming out as recent as this week with the vertical land movement data coming out by the NZ Rise project. The conversations are starting to happen. What do we do about it? How do we adapt our infrastructure, our marae, our communities to a rising sea level? So this is where my PhD research is coming in, which is looking at developing a decolonised managed retreat strategy for Aotearoa New Zealand, particularly for Māori communities. This is really relevant at the moment with the RMA reform coming in, which is set to introduce the Climate Change Adaptation Act, which is set to fund and oversee the process of managed retreat. What does that look like for our Māori coastal communities? So this arrow diagram at the bottom is the idea for my framework, for my PhD framework. So we're looking to the past, using that concept of time, looking to the past to work in the present with what we have in the present to then move forward into the future. So the chapter 1 is looking to historical examples of marae and pā being relocated in the past. The second one is to systematically review all global Indigenous community adaptation. Third is, okay, now we're in the present. What does sea level rise mean in terms of the susceptibility of flooding and erosion for our coastal marae and pā? And then the fourth and fifth chapter will be co-developing that framework with at-risk kapu and iwi at our coasts to develop this decolonised framework to take the colonised managed retreat strategy away from that colonial origins to deliver on positive and equitable outcomes for our Indigenous Māori of Aotearoa New Zealand. So that's all the main bits. Now just some take-home messages I really want to get across is that Te Ao Māori and mātauranga Māori is interconnected, observational and intergenerational. In terms of Indigenous time, it makes sense regarding climate change, right? Because climate change is dealing with the future. Indigenous time puts higher value on that future. So if we take those concepts, we could view climate change in a different way. Pūrākau hold valuable information for the future, such as that example at Merata. We could use that pūrākau to understand if we have to retreat our homes, our infrastructure, our communities, where do we move them to? And research at the interface of these two knowledge systems is valid and it is much needed because, like I said, oftentimes research at the interface can deliver positive outcomes compared to when research in those separate streams are done on their own. So I think there's value in that, and I think as time progresses, more and more research at the interface is coming out. And especially with climate change, we're going to need that research at the interface. It is so important. So that is my presentation. I'm not sure what the time is going, but ngā mihi everyone, and yeah, kia ora.
Kia ora Tūhata, ka pai. Great presentation and new concepts for many of us to think through and just how we apply it and what we are doing. Climate change is a broad subject and quite a complex issue, and I've become more and more aware that New Zealand, we've actually got a superpower compared to other countries, and in other roles I'm involved in, I'm becoming more aware of the superpower, and that is Te Ao Māori. And just what we can be doing with that superpower. Do you have any thoughts about how we can leverage Te Ao Māori more within the country?
I think A key way is to have capacity. I think the more people who understand how Te Ao Māori works and the intricacies of Te Ao Māori in the spaces of power, in universities, in industry, in these spaces, I think that'll help in terms of leveraging it more and uncovering those gems within Te Ao Māori to help us understand climate change. At the moment, the capacity is not as much as it should be, but I think I'm quite hopeful that the next generation of scientists, of researchers, of engineers that are coming through the ranks are cognizant of the power that Te Ao Māori has and the power of knowing and understanding Te Ao Māori has for their research. So I think capacity is a really key factor in that.
We've got a number of questions coming through which people are upvoting. Before we start, maybe if you drop your slide and then I'll get to
sharing. Yep.
Stop sharing. Great. So if I just jump straight into the questions that are on the system, Rob Bell's asked a question on how can our current New Zealand planning timeframes of 10 years for RMA plans and 30 years for infrastructure strategies be reset to weave in the longer term perspectives for adaptation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, that's an interesting question, Rob. I don't think I have an answer for that. I think that's going to take a lot of policy changes and institutional changes to change our way of how time is perceived in the planning industry in these spaces. I'm not really sure. I don't really have a clear-cut answer on that. Yeah.
I think you are right. I think it's a lot of work needed in terms of those changes if we are wanting to see a longer time frame taken into consideration.
Yeah, for sure.
Steve's asked a question about what does decolonised managed retreat mean for New Zealand? And I had a question which was sort of building on your discussion about what the work you're doing, and for myself as an engineer, our response is often defend. So we probably come from a westernised view of we need to defend against the climate, against the impacts. However, managed retreat is quite a different concept.
Yeah.
Can you just expand on what that means for us?
Yeah, for sure. So decolonisation is it's an interesting term, right? Because the idea of, so if we look at managed retreat is the management and the moving of infrastructure and communities away from a hazard. So that's very colonial in the way it's perceived, especially by Indigenous communities. So the way I see decolonised managed retreat is taking the concept of managed retreat, removing the colonial context around it, and with communities at risk, with Māori communities at risk, try to develop a new understanding of managed retreat separate to the colonial histories that it holds. So that's one idea of how I perceive what decolonisation is. However, decolonisation is going to take institutional change, it's going to take policy change, it's going to, decolonisation needs to happen in so many spaces. But this has really come through speaking with marae at risk, that the idea of the RMA reform coming through, there's a risk that some of these policies are almost perpetuating that idea of colonisation and colonial history, such as land confiscations or forced removals from land. So this is just that first step in understanding what it looks like. And the other question, talking about how, coming from an engineering perspective, protect is often the go-to idea. And I can see the validity in it and the relevance, but sometimes protecting isn't going to be a solution that many marae are going to be able to enact, because oftentimes protecting can be quite expensive, and for a lot of marae that's not a viable option. So we need to look at this. However, managed retreat is also an expensive process. However, international studies have shown that when managed retreat isn't the metaphorical ambulance at the end of the hill, it is part of the conversation from the beginning. It is often has better outcomes when it's that way. So I think managed retreat is not the strategy and protect is not the strategy. I think managed retreat needs to be part of that conversation, and so does protecting, but it needs to be accepted by those communities that are at risk, and it needs to be engaged and discussed and pulled apart and re-put back together to really hone in on what's really what's important and what's going to work for those communities.
Right. Other questions we've got coming through. Harvey Smith has said, do you think there are difficulties in matching the timelines from an event-based sense of time to a Western-based sense of time? And could that skill be used in predictions of events like Matata?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I'm not quite sure what the question's asking. So is it asking how we can draw parallels between Western ideas of time and event-based time?
Yeah, I think it's the difficulties of matching the time line between the Māori worldview and the Western sense of time. And so often from a Western perspective, we'll look back 10, 20 years and see if there's any flooding.
Yeah.
But from a Te Ao Māori, there's hundreds of years of stories.
Yeah. And again, I think that comes down to changes within the way that policy is done, industry is done. However, I can't comment on that too in depth because not much has really been done in that space. This is still uncharted territory, right? In terms of understanding that. But I think building that capability and capacity to be able to do these things within those spaces of change and policy is going to be crucial heading into the future. But yeah, it's a hard question to answer in terms of yeah. Sorry if that didn't answer the question. It's quite a complicated.
No, completely understand. We've got one from Troy Rockbank, which has been voted up, and he's asked what challenges could you give us as engineers and as climate change practitioners to embrace Te Ao Māori and empower the use of mātauranga Māori in the mahi, the work we do. So what's the challenge you put out to all of the people that are online today?
I think just the challenge is just to be open to new ideas, new concepts of ways of knowing, of being, of doing. I think that's really crucial to have an open mind with regards to this, because oftentimes, we get stuck in our silos of, oh, I'm a scientist, I only do science, or I'm an engineer, I only do engineering. But I think when we start to open ourselves up to these different knowledge systems, that's where the gems start to come in. So I would pose a challenge of be open, have conversations with your Māori colleagues, or if you're engaged with a hapu, have conversations like that. Show up for a cup of tea with them and just talk, A lot of times it's building these connections and being open to new ways of knowing when you start to build that capacity, build that capability to work in these spaces. So that's what I would challenge people, is to be open.
Be open-minded and understanding.
Yeah.
And see the other side. Great challenge for us. We've got a question here, which is, given that many of the challenges we're facing going forward are unprecedented in both Western and Indigenous history, how much value does looking backwards into the past help us adapt now?
I think there's yes, the future is unprecedented, but I think there is some value in looking to the past to understand what that looks like. So if we look at it from a Maori perspective, and managed retreat. So managed retreat is a hard pill to swallow, because Maori have been through, land loss, confiscations, removals. But I think when we look to the past, particularly with managed retreat, and we see that our marae have relocated in the past in response to natural hazards, I feel that we can draw strength from those histories and draw strength from that information to understand how we can move forward in the future. Yes, the future is unprecedented, but a lot of the time the future is unprecedented because we don't know what's going to happen. So I think it's not really looking at it like that, it's more looking to, okay, what can we draw strength from? Draw resilience, draw inspiration, draw, that's what I would say. Just draw strengths from the past, because the future is unprecedented regardless of if it had climate change. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. So, yeah.
Yeah, good response. I think if we look back into the very, very distant past, we've had the climate change precedent would have been very different 10,000, 100,000, a million years ago. So while we may think that change is happening now to us, it's probably very small compared to what happened thousands and thousands of years ago.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, just looking at some of the other questions that we've got coming through. Katie has answered. So Katie Simmons has asked a question. Are there existing networks that we can engage with to better understand the impacts of climate change on Māori communities and work together to tackle them, incorporating Te Ao Māori approach into our proposed engineering solutions?
Sure. I'm part of a couple of Indigenous climate change groups and research committees. One of them is my iwi Te Arawa. I have the Te Arawa climate change strategy, where it's run by hapu and iwi of Te Arawa, looking at, okay, what are the issues regarding climate change that our iwi, our whānau, our hapu are going to face heading into the future. And we write proposals, we write requests, we conduct research as part of this collective. So I feel if you're able to be part of those types of groups, that it could enable sort of those dialogues between non-Māori researchers, engineers, scientists, and Māori researchers, engineers, and scientists. I'm also part of another group called Te Ahu o Rehua, a cross-cultural knowledge, ocean knowledge group. And it's a conglomerate of many Indigenous researchers, Indigenous postgrad students, that we all have some form of connection of our research to the oceans. And quite a few of us in that conglomerate are climate change related researchers. And we have these discussions around climate change, Indigenous communities, and what it's going to mean. And I feel if we have more spaces, and we've made a concerted effort to do this, to bring non-Māori researchers, postgrad students to our meetings, to our wānanga, to really bring them in a safe space to learn, to understand, to be part of these discussions. Because again, that's where the gems are happening, in these wānanga, in these groups, in these spaces. So that's one way I would suggest, and they are happening. I know that I'm just speaking from what I've experienced and who I'm a part of, but I'm sure this is happening around the country. I know Ngāi Tahu have their climate change committee, climate change group in the South Island, and I know many hapu in Tauranga Moana and Northland region who are forming their climate change strategies. That's one way that we can be part of that conversation.
And maybe as Engineering New Zealand, we can look at sharing some of those forums so that people know where they can go and be part of the discussion.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, we've got a question from Priya, and they've asked, is there any chance of existing literature on Maori perspectives or learnings from the past on climate change? So is there any literature out there which is available to the general public?
Oh, it's very sparse, the literature, especially the peer-reviewed literature around Indigenous Māori perspectives on climate change. There's a lot around Māori and natural hazards, which you could inter being climate change will exacerbate those natural hazards, so you can draw parallels there, but not much historical work, peer-reviewed work is done in the climate change space in Māori. But there is quite a lot in contemporary times. We have legends such as Dan Hukaroa, Darren King, Sean Awatere, Huana Smith, Troy Brockbank. We have all these people who are pushing the boundaries in this area of climate change in Māori, and the literature is starting to come out. So I'm hopeful that we will start, but in the past there's not much really to go off in terms of climate change.
Okay. We've got a number of questions. I'm just going to look through and see which ones are being voted up. Brendan's asked, what are some of the successful forums that you've seen that allow time and space for kōrero between mātauranga Māori and Western science / engineering? And how can we support resource that kōrero? So is there any existing forums out there where there is the discussion going on between the two different views?
I'm unaware of any in Aotearoa New Zealand, but I am aware of discussions happening in the States with Kyle White. He wrote a paper about time as kinship, and he brought in this idea of the ticking time clock and the way that Indigenous view time compared to how non-Indigenous view time. So I know that's happening overseas, these conversations. However, in New Zealand, I'm unaware of any forums or any conversations happening. Although we can draw strengths from those international work happening and sort of started ourselves here in Aotearoa New Zealand, because there's validity in understanding how two different concepts of time can help our understanding, right? And that comes back to the idea of being open to these sorts of conversations and discussions. So I think we should start it ourselves. That'd be quite cool, if there's not one already that I'm unaware of.
Okay, we've been through a lot of the questions. Ian Watson has asked a probably challenging question here. It's around, with Māori culture given special value to land, sea and fresh water, and we've got the organisations such as the Environmental Defence Society who have drawn on these values, joining with hapu when fighting developments which affect land, sea and fresh water.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that Pakeha need to get on board with accepting some of the Maori values when planning projects, especially when addressing climate change?
I think so, because we have to look at that, was it a paper? No, it was an article in the Listener brought out by those, was it 6 professors from Auckland University, talking about how mātauranga Māori isn't science, and that if you call mātauranga Māori science, that you're degrading the concepts. I think that's what's happening in Aotearoa New Zealand in terms of the settler colonial society of Aotearoa. And I think that sometimes we need to, again, be open to new ideas, to new ways of knowing, to new knowledges, to new ways of doing. And I think that's a challenge, and it's not an easy pill to swallow, I understand. But I think we need to push past that I'd almost call it whakamā or shyness. We need to push past that and move forward, because climate change is happening. We can't just sit in our sit in the same old seat and say that we don't do it that way. It's like we know it's there, let's move forward and use both to understand how we can move forward. I hope that answered the question. I kind of got lost partway through what I was saying. I forgot what the question was about.
No, you did, Akuhata, thank you. And I think you're right. I think we live in Aotearoa. We need to understand the concepts of Te Ao Māori and how we apply that to what we're doing in terms of developments going forward.
Yeah.
We're probably getting right off the climate change work we've done in terms of getting into the discussions around Te Treaty and other things, which is probably worth another
conversation all in itself.
Very much so. So I think we've probably come to the end of the questions and our time is getting short. So thank you, Akuhata. It's been an insightful discussion on climate change and the impacts on Aotearoa. Great to have you on this first kōrero for Engineering New Zealand and hear your perspectives. It's definitely an area that we need to be thinking about when we go through and look at what we're doing as designers of infrastructure in the communities of the future. Taking your concept of fertility of time and the importance of looking backwards as well as looking into the future. That concept of fertility of the present and the Indigenous concept of time makes sense regarding climate change and when engineers consider designs. And that's an important thing for us to be considering. So thank you for your time and for sharing your experience. That's all we have time for today. I hope everyone has found this as insightful as I have, and I look forward to the next climate change conversation. Ka kite anō, everyone.
Ngā mihi.